flight attendant kicks black family off plane, finds out they own the airline. Rebecca Collins stood frozen in her dimly lit apartment, her trembling hands clutching the edge of her kitchen counter. The room spun around her as panic clawed at her chest, each breath becoming more labored than the last. The letter of termination from Skylux Airlines lay crumpled on the floor, a stark reminder of how quickly 15 years of career could crumble. Her mind flashed back to that moment in the VIP lounge, the scene that would haunt her forever. James Johnson's calm, measured voice echoing in her ears, "I think you misunderstand who we are. Miss Collins. We don't just fly first class, we own the airline." The memory sent another wave of nausea through her body. She could still see Camille Johnson's penetrating gaze, filled not with anger but with something far worse, disappointment. "What have you learned in 15 years, Rebecca?" The question had cut deeper than any accusation could. The sound of her phone buzzing on the counter made her flinch. Another message from her sister Catherine, probably. Or maybe another hate comment on social media. The story had spread like wildfire. Veteran flight attendant kicked out after discriminating against airline's own owners. Through her apartment window, she caught her reflection, pale, haunted, barely recognizable. Was this really the same confident woman who had prided herself on her professionalism? The same Rebecca Collins who had spent years building a reputation for excellence? A child's laughter from the playground below drew her attention. Two little girls, one black, one white, playing together without a care in the world. The sight sent tears streaming down her face as the full weight of her actions crashed over her. How had she let her hidden biases destroy everything she'd worked for? And more importantly, how could she ever make this right? If this opening scene touched your heart and sparked your curiosity, join us on this powerful journey of redemption by subscribing. Every story we share explores the depths of human nature and the transformative power of facing our own truths. Don't miss what happens next. 15 years earlier, Rebecca Collins stood in her childhood home's kitchen, watching her father Thomas Collins tie his tie for what would be the last time. A respected investment banker with 30 years of experience, Thomas had built his reputation on trust and integrity. But that morning, his hands trembled as he prepared to face the consequences of trusting the wrong person. "It'll be okay, Dad," Rebecca said, trying to sound confident. "We can start over," but they both knew it wasn't that simple. Marcus Thompson, a promising African-American entrepreneur, had convinced Thomas to invest not only his own savings but also his clients' money in what turned out to be an elaborate Ponzi scheme. The revelation had destroyed everything: their family's savings, Thomas's reputation, and their future. That evening, instead of coming home, Thomas drove to the George Washington Bridge. Rebecca would never forget the police officer's words at 3 a.m., "We found his car." And the note simply read, "I'm sorry, I couldn't bear the shame." The man who had taught her about integrity and responsibility had chosen to escape rather than face the consequences of his misplaced trust. The aftermath was brutal. Their family home was seized, her mother Janet retreated into depression, and Rebecca was forced to abandon her college dreams. The media coverage was relentless, painting her father as either a victim or a fool. But what cut deepest was Marcus Thompson's apparent success. While the Collins family crumbled, he seemed to thrive, untouched by the destruction he'd caused. Rebecca took a job as a flight attendant at Skylux Airlines, drawn to the promise of stability and structure. The uniform became her armor, the strict protocols her shield. Year by year, she built herself into someone new, composed, professional, in control. Her colleagues admired her precision, her supervisors praised her efficiency, and passengers appreciated her polished demeanor. But beneath the perfect exterior, something darker grew. Every time she encountered successful African-American passengers, she felt a flicker of that old pain. She masked it well, channeling it into what she called professional skepticism. If she was sometimes colder to certain passengers, well, that was just maintaining standards, wasn't it? The irony was that no one knew about her father. She'd buried that story so deep that even her closest coworkers thought she'd put herself through school through hard work alone. The truth about Thomas Collins and Marcus Thompson became her secret shame, feeding a prejudice she wouldn't even admit to herself. Then came the day she found out the truth that would shake her carefully constructed world. Marcus Thompson hadn't acted alone. He'd been set up by larger players who used him as the face of the scheme while they walked away with millions. Thompson himself had lost everything, just like her father. By the time this came to light, he had died in poverty, his reputation in ruins. But Rebecca never learned this truth, not then. Instead, she continued to rise through the ranks at Skylux, her hidden biases calcifying into unspoken rules. She became known for her exacting standards, particularly in first class, where she took silent pride in determining who did and didn't belong. The perfect facade she'd built would hold for 15 years, until a fateful flight with James and Camille Johnson would force her to confront everything she'd buried. But on that morning, as she prepared for Flight 512 to Paris, Rebecca Collins believed she was exactly who she was supposed to be, a consummate professional who had overcome tragedy through discipline and determination. She had no idea that her carefully constructed world was about to shatter, or that its destruction would ultimately lead to her salvation. Skylux Airlines became Rebecca Collins' sanctuary, a world where rules and procedures provided the certainty her life had lacked. Her initial training class of 20 dwindled to 12, but Rebecca excelled, finding comfort in the rigid standards and precise protocols. Each uniform inspection, every safety drill, gave her a sense of control she desperately craved. During her first year, a senior flight attendant named Sarah Mitchell took Rebecca under her wing. "You remind me of myself," Sarah said one day as they prepared the cabin for boarding, "so focused, so determined." What Sarah didn't know was that Rebecca's precision wasn't just professionalism, it was survival. By her third year, Rebecca had earned a reputation for excellence, particularly in first-class service. Her evaluations consistently praised her attention to detail and passenger discretion. "Collins has an intuitive understanding of our premium passengers," one supervisor wrote. "She knows who belongs in first class." That last phrase became something of a personal motto for Rebecca, though its darker implications remained unexamined. The incident that cemented her reputation came during her 5th year. A wealthy passenger had become belligerent, demanding special treatment, and threatening to have her fired. Rebecca handled him with such diplomatic precision that he not only apologized but wrote a commendation letter to the airline. Her response became part of the training manual: "Standards aren't negotiable, but grace is our signature." As she rose through the ranks, Rebecca developed what she called her passenger radar, an ability to spot potential issues before they arose. She took pride in maintaining the exclusive atmosphere of first class, though her methods sometimes raised eyebrows. Melissa Baker, a newer flight attendant, once questioned her about repeatedly double-checking a well-dressed African-American couple's tickets. "It's not about race," Rebecca had responded smoothly. "It's about maintaining standards. Some passengers just don't understand the level of service we provide." She believed her own words, never connecting her instincts to the trauma she'd buried. Her personal life became secondary to her career. A few relationships fizzled when partners complained about her rigid scheduling and emotional distance. "It's like you're still in uniform, even when you're home," her last boyfriend said as he walked out. Rebecca told herself it was a small price to pay for security and success. By her 10th year, Rebecca was training other flight attendants, instilling in them her exacting standards. "First class isn't just a cabin," she would tell them. "It's a promise to our premium passengers. We're the guardians of that promise." Her trainees learned to spot irregular situations, a euphemism that often masked unconscious biases. The irony was that Rebecca saw herself as completely fair. She treated everyone according to their behavior, or so she believed. If she scrutinized certain passengers more closely, if she was slower to respond to their requests, well, that was just being thorough, wasn't it? When the airline introduced diversity training in her 13th year, Rebecca sat through the sessions with polite attention and perfect answers. "Of course, I treat everyone equally," she wrote in her evaluation. "I'm a professional." The trainers praised her responses, never seeing the walls she'd built around her heart. As her 15th anniversary with Skylux approached, Rebecca Collins was at the peak of her career. Her personnel file bulged with commendations. First-class passengers requested her by name. Senior management considered her for a supervisory position. She had survived her father's suicide, rebuilt her life, and created a reputation for unmatched professional excellence. Then came Flight 512 to Paris and the Johnson family. In hindsight, Rebecca would recognize that moment as the beginning of her unraveling. But as she prepared the cabin that evening, straightening seats with practiced precision, She had no idea she was about to encounter the very thing she'd spent 15 years denying the truth about herself. The evening of Flight 512 to Paris began like any other. Rebecca Collins stood at the first-class cabin entrance, her posture perfect, her uniform immaculate. The October air held a crisp promise of autumn, and the setting sun cast long shadows through the terminal windows. Everything was proceeding according to her meticulous standards until she saw them approaching. James and Camille Johnson walked toward the gate with their 2 children, Emily and Marcus, aged 8 and 6. There was something about them that caught Rebecca's attention immediately. James wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that spoke of quiet wealth, while Camille's elegant simplicity suggested refined taste. Their children were impeccably behaved, holding their parents' hands and speaking in hushed tones. Yet something stirred in Rebecca's chest, a familiar unease she'd learned to disguise as professional concern. She watched them approach, her practiced smile fixed in place as she scanned their boarding passes. First-class tickets all in order, but that nagging feeling persisted. "Good evening," James said warmly, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "Lovely evening for flying." Rebecca's response was professional but cool. "Indeed, may I see your boarding passes again?" She made a show of double-checking what she'd already verified, aware of the growing line behind them. The Johnsons exchanged a quick glance but complied without complaint. "Is there a problem?" Camille asked, her tone perfectly modulated. She placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder as the little girl looked up questioningly. "Just being thorough," Rebecca replied, her words clipped. "Protocol, you understand." She noticed Melissa, her fellow flight attendant, watching the interaction with barely concealed concern. The tension might have ended there, but Rebecca's thoroughness extended to suggesting they check their carry-on bags despite plenty of overhead space and questioning their seating assignment. First class tends to be rather particular, she said, her implication hanging in the air. James Johnson's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. "We're quite familiar with first class, Miss Collins," he said, reading her name tag. "Perhaps more than you realize." Rebecca felt a flash of irritation at what she perceived as a challenge to her authority. She directed them to their seats with rigid politeness, but her mind was already cataloging ways to maintain what she considered proper standards during the flight. As the Johnsons settled into their seats, Rebecca overheard Emily ask, "Daddy, why did the lady check our tickets twice?" "Some people see what they expect to see." "Sweetheart," James replied softly, "our job is to show them a different way of seeing." The comment stung, though Rebecca pretended not to hear it. She busied herself with other passengers, but her attention kept drifting back to the Johnson family. They were quiet, dignified, and unfailingly polite, which somehow made her even more determined to find fault. Melissa approached her in the galley. "Rebecca, they seem like a lovely family. Why are you?" "I know what I'm doing," Rebecca cut her off. "Sometimes people find ways to game the system. We have standards to maintain." "Standards?" Melissa's voice held a note of disbelief. "Or assumptions?" Rebecca turned away, unwilling to acknowledge the question. She didn't see Melissa's disappointed expression, or notice her reach for her phone with purpose. Instead, she focused on her duties, unaware that her next actions would set in motion a chain of events that would shatter her carefully constructed world. The flight was about to begin, and with it, Rebecca Collins would start down a path that would force her to confront everything she'd spent 15 years denying. But in that moment, standing in her pressed uniform with her perfect posture, she believed she was simply doing her job, maintaining standards she'd convinced herself were about excellence rather than exclusion. As Flight 512 reached cruising altitude, Rebecca's subtle discrimination took on a more calculated form. When serving pre-flight champagne, she deliberately skipped the Johnson family's row, attending to other first-class passengers with exaggerated courtesy. The contrast was stark, warm smiles for some, cold efficiency for others. "Excuse me," Camille called softly after 10 minutes. "I believe we were overlooked during the beverage service." Her dignity only heightened Rebecca's inexplicable irritation. "My apologies," Rebecca responded, her tone suggesting anything but regret. "We're experiencing some delays in service." She watched Camille share a knowing look with James, their composed reaction somehow more unsettling than any complaint would have been. The tension escalated during dinner service. Rebecca saved their row for last, ensuring their meals arrived nearly cold. When Emily, their young daughter, accidentally dropped her napkin, Rebecca merely pointed to it rather than helping a sharp departure from her usual attentive service. Mommy, Emily whispered, though loud enough for Rebecca to hear. Why doesn't she like us? The innocent question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Some people carry hurts they don't understand, sweetheart, Camille answered, her voice gentle but carrying. It's not about us. A distinguished-looking passenger a few rows ahead, Michael Thompson, observed the interaction with growing concern. Missy called to Rebecca. I couldn't help but notice a discrepancy in service quality. Is there a reason for this? Selective attention. Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks but maintained her professional mask. I assure you, sir, all passengers receive appropriate service according to our standards. Appropriate, Thompson's eyebrow raised. I've flown Skylux for years. This isn't the service standard I know. Meanwhile, Melissa watched from the galley, her discomfort evident. She approached Rebecca during a quiet moment. This isn't you, she whispered. I've worked with you for years. What's really going on? But Rebecca brushed her off, her defenses rising higher. You're new, Melissa. You don't understand the complexities of maintaining first-class standards. The situation reached a breaking point when Marcus Johnson, the 6-year-old, asked for water. Rebecca responded with, We're currently attending to priority requests despite having just served water to other passengers. James Johnson finally spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. Priority requests? I wasn't aware there was a hierarchy within first class, Miss Collins. Perhaps you're not familiar with our service protocols, Rebecca replied, the condescension in her tone unmistakable. Oh, I'm quite familiar with Skylux's protocols, James responded, a subtle edge entering his voice. More than you might imagine. Throughout the flight, Rebecca failed to notice James making several quiet phone calls or Melissa documenting each interaction in her phone. She was too focused on maintaining what she believed was proper order, blind to the fact that she was orchestrating her own downfall. As the flight progressed, other passengers began whispering among themselves. The contrast between the Johnsons' dignity and Rebecca's thinly veiled hostility became increasingly apparent. Yet the family maintained their composure, responding to each slight with grace that only served to highlight the inappropriateness of Rebecca's behavior. Camille spent the flight engaging her children in quiet activities, shielding them from the tension while teaching them a powerful lesson in handling prejudice with dignity. Remember, she whispered to them, how people treat you says more about them than about you. By the time the flight began its descent into Paris, Rebecca had created an unmistakable pattern of discrimination, all while believing she was simply upholding standards. She remained oblivious to the storm gathering around her, unaware that every interaction was being noted and would soon come back to challenge everything she thought she knew about herself. The revelation began to unfold as Flight 512 touched down in Paris. Rebecca stood at her station preparing for deplaning, still convinced she had handled the situation with professional aplomb. The first hint that something was amiss came when the captain requested her presence in the cockpit, an unusual occurrence after landing. Rebecca, Captain David Anderson, spoke gravely, his expression unreadable. There's something you need to know before we begin deplaning. He paused, his next words hitting her like a physical blow. The Johnson family you've been monitoring throughout the flight, they're not just first-class passengers. Rebecca's perfectly maintained composure wavered slightly. I don't understand. James and Camille Johnson are the new majority stakeholders of Skylux Airlines, Anderson continued, each word landing like a hammer blow. They were conducting an informal service evaluation, and from what I'm hearing, it didn't go well. The blood drained from Rebecca's face as the implications crashed over her. Her mind raced back through every interaction, every subtle slight, every moment of barely concealed disdain. The room seemed to spin as Captain Anderson continued speaking. They're waiting for you in the VIP lounge, he said. This isn't a request, Rebecca. Several passengers have already filed complaints about your behavior, and Mr. Thompson in 3A is apparently on the board of directors. Rebecca's legs felt weak as she made her way through the empty first-class cabin. Each step was an effort, her perfectly polished shoes suddenly seeming to weigh a ton. She caught her reflection in a window, her immaculate uniform, her perfect posture, all the trappings of authority she had hidden behind for so long. The walk to the VIP lounge felt like a march to execution. When she entered, James and Camille Johnson were seated calmly, their children noticeably absent. The contrast between their composed demeanor and her internal chaos was stark. "Miss Collins," James began, his voice level. "Please have a seat," he gestured to a chair across from them, the simple action carrying undeniable authority. Rebecca sat stiffly, her training warring with her panic. "Mr. Johnson, I can explain." "Can you?" Camille interrupted, her voice soft but penetrating. "Can you explain why our children had to experience discrimination at such a young age? Why our daughter had to ask why someone didn't like her because of how she looked?" The words struck Rebecca like physical blows. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. "We didn't buy this airline just for profit," James continued. "We bought it because we believed in creating an inclusive space in an industry that often lacks it. Tonight, you've shown us just how much work there is to do." Rebecca's carefully constructed defenses began to crumble. "I was just maintaining standards," she whispered, the excuse sounding hollow even to her own ears. "Standards?" Camille's eyebrow raised. "Like assuming we didn't belong in first class? Like making our children wait for water while serving others immediately? Those standards." Each example pierced Rebecca's professional armor, exposing the prejudices she had denied for so long. She felt tears threatening but held them back through sheer force of will. "What's most concerning," James added, "is that you genuinely seem to believe your behavior was justified. That's not just about this flight, Miss Collins, that's about who you've become." The truth of his words hit her with devastating force. Who had she become? When had maintaining standards become a shield for her own biases? 15 years of service, Camille mused, her eyes never leaving Rebecca's face. 15 years of experience, and yet you couldn't see past your own prejudices to treat a family with basic dignity. What does that say about the standards you're so proud of? Rebecca felt her world tilting on its axis. Everything she had built her identity around, her professionalism, her authority, her carefully maintained standards, was crumbling before her eyes. "We'll be reviewing this incident thoroughly," James concluded. "But more importantly, Miss Collins, you need to review yourself, because this isn't just about a job anymore. It's about the person you've allowed yourself to become." As Rebecca left the VIP lounge, her legs barely supporting her, she passed Melissa in the corridor. The younger flight attendant's expression was a mix of sympathy and disappointment. "I tried to warn you," she said softly, "but you wouldn't listen." The full weight of what had happened was beginning to descend on Rebecca. She had not just jeopardized her career, she had exposed the ugly truth she had been hiding from herself for 15 years. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of administrative procedures and mounting humiliation. Rebecca sat rigid and pale in Skylux's Paris office as Laura Matthews, the regional director, read out the terms of her immediate suspension. Multiple passenger complaints, Laura read from her tablet, her voice clinically detached, documented instances of discriminatory behavior. Violation of our core service principles, she looked up, her expression a mix of disappointment and disbelief. "Rebecca, you've been with us 15 years. How did we get here?" The suspension letter felt heavy in Rebecca's trembling hands. Paid leave, pending investigation, mandatory sensitivity training, psychological evaluation, each requirement another nail in the coffin of her career. But what struck deepest was the final paragraph: "This incident has been reported to corporate headquarters for review by the Johnson family personally." News of the incident spread through airline circles with devastating speed. By the time Rebecca's flight landed back in New York, her phone was flooded with messages. Some expressed shock, others disappointment. A few longtime colleagues sent messages of support, but their words rang hollow against the growing chorus of condemnation. The worst came when she checked social media. Someone had filmed parts of her interactions with the Johnsons, and the clips were going viral. "Racist flight attendant learns hard lesson," read one headline. "Karma serves first class," bigot declared another. Her carefully curated professional image was being shredded in real time. Walking through JFK Airport, Rebecca felt exposed, as if everyone could see through her uniform to the shame beneath. In the employee locker room, conversation stopped when she entered. Former friends suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. The solidarity she had counted on for 15 years evaporated in the face of her exposed prejudice. "Mom," her daughter Sarah's voice cracked over the phone that evening, "is it true what they're saying online?" About what happened on the flight, the pain in her 12-year-old's voice was unbearable. Sarah had always been proud of her mother's job, often bragging about her mom, the respected flight attendant. "Sweetheart, it's complicated," Rebecca began, but Sarah cut her off. "Emily Johnson is in my class, Mom. She's my friend. How could you treat her family like that?" The revelation hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She couldn't have known that her actions would ripple so close to home. The thought of her daughter facing the consequences of her prejudice was almost too much to bear. The suspension notice required her to surrender her wings, the silver pin that marked her as a Skylux flight attendant. As she unpinned it from her uniform, her hands shook so badly she pricked her finger. A drop of blood stained the pristine fabric, a fitting metaphor for how thoroughly she had stained her own reputation. That night, alone in her apartment, Rebecca finally broke down. The facade of professional dignity crumbled completely as she sobbed, 15 years of buried emotions flooding out. She cried for her lost career, for her daughter's pain, for the shame she had brought upon herself. But mostly she cried for the person she had become without even realizing it. A text message from Melissa pierced through her grief. "I know you're hurting, but maybe this is where healing begins. When you're ready to talk, I'm here. There's more to this story than you know." The cryptic nature of Melissa's message barely registered through Rebecca's despair. She was too consumed by the immediate crisis to notice the hint of something deeper. Instead, she sat in her dark apartment, still in her uniform, surrounded by the wreckage of her carefully constructed life. Morning brought no relief. The sight of her uniform hanging in the closet, now unwearable, sent her rushing to the bathroom to be sick. The morning news carried the story, complete with grainy cell phone footage of her coldest moments. Her sister Catherine left a scathing voicemail. "How could you? After everything Dad taught us about treating people with respect." Rebecca Collins, who had prided herself on maintaining the highest standards, now found herself facing the lowest point of her life. But she had no idea that this was only the beginning, that the true depth of her fall and the possibility of redemption were still to come. 1 week into her suspension, Rebecca sat in her favorite coffee shop, tucked away in a corner where she hoped no one would recognize her. The cafe had been her sanctuary during better days, but now even its familiar comfort felt hollow. She was staring into her untouched latte when Melissa slid into the seat across from her. "You look terrible," Melissa said softly, no judgment in her voice. "When's the last time you slept?" Rebecca couldn't remember. The days had blurred together in a haze of anxiety and shame. She looked at her former colleague, noting how Melissa seemed different, somehow more serious, carrying a weight of her own. "Why are you here?" Rebecca asked, her voice hoarse. "Everyone else has abandoned ship. Why haven't you?" Melissa took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders as if preparing for battle. "Because I need to tell you something. Something that might help you understand why this happened and why I had to report your behavior to the Johnsons." Rebecca's head snapped up. "You reported me." "Yes," Melissa admitted. "But not for the reasons you think." She pulled out an old newspaper clipping from her bag, sliding it across the table. Rebecca's breath caught. It was the article about her father's suicide. "How did you?" "My father was Marcus Thompson," Melissa said quietly. The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Marcus Thompson, the man she had blamed for her father's death, the source of her buried prejudice, the reason for her distrust. Her coffee cup clattered against its saucer as her hands began to shake. "That's impossible," Rebecca whispered. "I changed my name to my mother's maiden name, Baker, when I started at Skylux," Melissa continued. "I'd been watching you for years, trying to find a way to tell you the truth about what really happened to our fathers." Rebecca's world tilted on its axis as Melissa pulled out more documents, court records, bank statements, emails. "My father wasn't the mastermind, Rebecca. He was a pawn, just like your father. They were both victims of the same group of white-collar criminals." The evidence was undeniable. Marcus Thompson had been set up as the face of the scheme while the real perpetrators walked away with millions. He had died broken and penniless, just like Rebecca's father, his reputation in ruins. "The Johnsons," Melissa continued, her voice gentle but firm, "were the ones who finally exposed the truth. James Johnson's investment firm uncovered the real fraud years later. He tried to clear both our fathers' names, but it was too late." Rebecca's hands trembled as she read through the documents. Every certainty she had built her life around was crumbling. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Would you have believed me?" Melissa asked softly. "You had built such strong walls around your pain. I watched you take it out on innocent passengers for years, telling yourself it was about standards when it was really about hurt." Tears began rolling down Rebecca's cheeks as 15 years of misplaced blame and prejudice crashed over her. "I've been so wrong," she whispered. "About everything." "When I saw how you were treating the Johnsons," Melissa continued, "I knew it had to stop. Not just for them, but for you. For both of us. For our father's memory." Rebecca looked up at Melissa through her tears, seeing her clearly for the first time. The younger woman's eyes held no condemnation, only understanding and a shared pain. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely audible. "That depends on you," Melissa replied. "The Johnsons know everything about our fathers, about why I reported you. They want to help, Rebecca, but first you have to help yourself." As the truth settled over her, Rebecca felt something shift inside a crack in the fortress of bias and pain she had built around her heart. She reached across the table and took Melissa's hand, a gesture of connection that bridged 15 years of misunderstanding. "I'm so sorry," Rebecca whispered, "for everything." "I know," Melissa said softly. "That's why I'm here. Because sometimes understanding where our pain comes from is the first step to healing it." The morning after Melissa's revelation, Rebecca faced another crisis. Her phone rang at 9 a.m. It was Sarah's school principal, Dr. Elizabeth Parker. "Mrs. Collins, we need you to come in immediately. There's been an incident involving Sarah." Rebecca found her daughter sitting in the principal's office, eyes red from crying, while Emily Johnson, of all people, sat beside her holding her hand. The sight stopped Rebecca in her tracks. "Some kids were saying horrible things about you, Mom," Sarah explained through tears. "They called you racist, said we were just like those people on TV who hate others. Emily stood up for me, and then 3 older students decided to make it physical," Dr. Parker finished gravely. "Both girls were defending each other. Mrs. Johnson is on her way." Rebecca's heart sank. Her shame had now touched her daughter, tainted her life at school. The irony of Emily Johnson defending Sarah wasn't lost on her. The child of the family she had discriminated against was now protecting her daughter from the fallout of that very discrimination. Camille Johnson arrived minutes later, her presence filling the room with quiet authority. Instead of anger, her face showed only concern as she went to check on both girls. "Are you all right, Sarah?" she asked gently, surprising Rebecca with her kindness. "I'm sorry," Sarah blurted out, looking between her mother and Mrs. Johnson. "About what happened on the plane. My mom, she's not." "Sweetheart," Camille interrupted softly, "you don't need to apologize for your mother's actions. And Emily doesn't need to apologize for standing by her friend." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. While she had been drowning in her own crisis, her daughter had been building bridges she herself had tried to burn. The girls' friendship stood as a testament to everything she had gotten wrong. The aftermath of the school incident rippled through their lives. Rebecca watched helplessly as Sarah faced whispers and stares in the hallways. Some parents requested their children be moved away from Sarah in class. The isolation that had been Rebecca's burden was now her daughter's inheritance. But something unexpected emerged from the crisis. Emily Johnson remained steadfastly by Sarah's side, and other students began to follow her lead. The daughter of the airline owners, popular and well-liked, had made her choice clear. She stood with her friend. One evening, Rebecca overheard Sarah on the phone with Emily. "Your mom was nice to me today," Sarah said. "Even after. You know why?" "Mom says hurt people, Emily replied with wisdom beyond her years. "But they can also heal. She says your mom just needs to find her way back to who she really is." The conversation haunted Rebecca. Who was she really? The professional flight attendant who prided herself on maintaining standards? The wounded daughter who had transformed her pain into prejudice? Or someone else entirely, someone she had yet to become? Sarah began spending more time at the Johnsons' house, invited for study sessions and weekend activities. Each time she returned, she carried stories of warmth and inclusion that made Rebecca's previous judgment seem even more shameful. "Mrs. Johnson asked about you today," Sarah mentioned casually one evening. "She wanted to know if you're okay. She said sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself." The weight of Camille Johnson's insight pressed on Rebecca's heart. Here was a woman she had disrespected, whose family she had humiliated, showing more concern for her welfare than many of her former friends. The final blow came when Sarah asked the question Rebecca had been dreading. "Mom, do you hate people who are different from us? Is that why you did what you did?" Rebecca gathered her daughter in her arms, tears streaming down both their faces. "No, sweetheart, I was wrong, so terribly wrong. I let old pain make me blind, but I promise you I'm learning to see clearly now." That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, Rebecca sat at her kitchen table writing 2 letters, one to Emily Johnson, thanking her for being the friend her daughter needed, and another to Camille and James, acknowledging not just her professional misconduct, but the deeper human damage she had caused. The breakdown, when it finally came, was spectacular in its totality. It happened during a mandatory counseling session required by Skylux Airlines 3 weeks into Rebecca's suspension. Dr. Rachel Turner, a compassionate but direct therapist, had asked what seemed like a simple question: "Tell me about your father." Rebecca had started calmly enough, recounting the facts as she had rehearsed them countless times. But when Dr. Turner gently pushed further, "And how did his death shape your view of trust?" something inside Rebecca shattered. "I trusted the wrong people," she began, her voice rising. "I trusted that if we did everything right, followed all the rules," her carefully maintained composure cracked. Years of suppressed emotion burst forth like a broken dam. "My father killed himself because a black man destroyed everything we had," she screamed, then immediately covered her mouth, horrified by her own words. "No, that's not. I know now that's not true, but I believed it for so long. I built my whole life around that lie." Dr. Turner watched as Rebecca paced the office like a caged animal, years of buried pain pouring out in an unstoppable torrent. "I made myself perfect," Rebecca continued, her voice breaking. "Perfect uniform, perfect service, perfect control. I thought if I could just maintain standards, keep everything in its proper place, I could stop it from happening again." The therapist's office became a confessional as Rebecca finally confronted the ugliness she had harbored. She spoke of how she'd channeled her pain into prejudice, how she'd used her position to make subtle judgments, how she'd convinced herself it was all about maintaining professional standards. "And now," Rebecca sobbed, collapsing onto the couch, "now I find out it was all based on a lie. Marcus Thompson was a victim too, my father. He died for nothing. And I've spent 15 years dishonoring his memory by becoming everything he taught me not to be." Dr. Turner let the silence settle before speaking. "Rebecca, what would your father think of who you've become?" The question broke something fundamental inside her. Rebecca curled into herself, her body racked with sobs. "He would be ashamed," she whispered, "so ashamed." The session continued well past its scheduled end time as Rebecca finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her actions. She spoke about Sarah and Emily's friendship, about Melissa's revelation, about the Johnsons' unexpected grace in the face of her prejudice. "I don't know who I am anymore," she admitted finally, her voice hoarse from crying. "Everything I built my life around was a lie." Perhaps Dr. Turner suggested gently, "That's not a bad place to start. Sometimes we need to break down completely before we can rebuild authentically." As Rebecca left the office that evening, exhausted but somehow lighter, she found Melissa waiting in the lobby. Without words, Melissa pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her as fresh tears came. "I didn't know you were here," Rebecca managed between sobs. "I'll always be here," Melissa replied quietly. "We're connected, Rebecca. Our father's story doesn't have to end in tragedy. We can write a different ending." That night, Rebecca did something she hadn't done since her father's death. She opened the box of his personal belongings. Among his papers, she found his old journal. The last entry, dated just days before his death, read, "The measure of a person isn't in never falling, but in how they rise after a fall. I pray someday my beautiful daughter understands this." Reading those words, Rebecca finally understood her father's legacy wasn't about maintaining perfect control or protecting herself from hurt. It was about the courage to face your mistakes and the strength to begin again. The revelation about James Johnson's connection to her father's case came during Rebecca's second month of therapy. Dr. Turner handed her a thick manila envelope that had been delivered to her office. "Someone thought you should see these," she said carefully. Inside were documents dating back 15 years, legal papers, investigation reports, and most significantly, letters written by James Johnson to Thomas Collins in the weeks before his death. Rebecca's hands trembled as she read the first letter. "Mr. Collins, I understand your reluctance to meet, but I believe I've uncovered evidence that both you and Marcus Thompson were deliberately set up. Please let me help clear both your names. The real perpetrators must be brought to justice. James Johnson, Financial Crimes Investigation Unit." There were more letters, each increasingly urgent, showing how James had tried desperately to reach her father. The final one was dated just 2 days before Thomas Collins took his lifetime as critical. "I have proof of your innocence. Please don't let him win by giving up." Rebecca sat frozen, the papers scattered around her in Dr. Turner's office. "He tried to save them both," she whispered. "The man I treated so shamefully on that flight. He tried to save my father." The documents revealed that James Johnson had been a rising star in financial crime investigation before starting his investment firm. He had tracked the real criminals for years, finally building a case that exposed the truth, but too late for both Thomas Collins and Marcus Thompson. "Your father never saw these letters," Dr. Turner explained gently. "They were returned unopened. The shame and depression had already taken hold." Melissa confirmed the story later that day over coffee. "James never stopped fighting for justice," she said. "Even after our fathers were gone, he kept pushing until he exposed the truth. That's partly why he bought Skylex, to create a company that stands for integrity and inclusion." The weight of this knowledge pressed on Rebecca's chest until she could hardly breathe. She had spent years nurturing prejudice against the very man who had tried to prevent her family's tragedy. The irony was almost too much to bear. That evening, she received an unexpected call from Camille Johnson. "We thought it was time you knew," she said softly. "James carried the guilt of not reaching your father in time. When he saw you on that flight, he recognized your name immediately." "Why didn't you tell me right away?" Rebecca asked, her voice breaking. "Because you weren't ready to hear it," Camille replied. "Sometimes people need to find their own way to the truth." The conversation continued as Camille shared more details. How James had never given up on clearing both men's names. How he had used his success to create opportunities for others who had been wronged by systemic injustice. How seeing Rebecca's prejudice on that flight had hit him particularly hard, knowing its origins. "James doesn't want your guilt," Rebecca Camille said finally. "He wants your understanding. Of yourself, of others, of how pain can either break us or transform us." Later that night, Rebecca found herself standing outside her father's grave for the first time in years. She placed James's unopened letters against the headstone, her tears falling freely. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered. "I took your pain and turned it into something ugly, but I promise you I'm going to make it right. I'm going to become someone you would be proud of again." As she turned to leave, she saw James Johnson standing quietly at a respectful distance. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Rebecca finally understood the true meaning of grace. Despite the healing beginning in therapy, the outside world showed no mercy. The viral video of Rebecca's behavior on Flight 512 had sparked a firestorm that refused to die down. Local news stations ran special segments on discrimination in the airlines featuring her story as a prime example. Her photograph appeared in newspapers, usually alongside headlines that painted her as the face of modern racism. The community's reaction was swift and merciless. One morning, Rebecca found her car vandalized, racist spray painted across the driver's side door. Her neighbors, once friendly, now crossed the street to avoid her. The local grocery store, where she'd shopped for years, suddenly felt hostile as whispers and pointed fingers followed her through the aisles. The hardest blow came from her own family. At a Sunday dinner she'd attended hoping for support, her sister Catherine stood up and delivered the final verdict. "You've embarrassed all of us," she declared, her voice trembling with anger. "Dad taught us better than this. Mom can't even leave the house because everyone knows what you did." Their mother, Margaret Collins, sat silently at the table, refusing to meet Rebecca's eyes. When Rebecca reached for her hand, she pulled away. "Your father would be so disappointed," she whispered, the words cutting deeper than any shouting could have. "Mom, please," Rebecca pleaded. "I'm trying to make it right." "Some things can't be made right," Catherine interrupted. "You need to stay away for a while, until this all blows over, if it ever does." Rebecca left her childhood home that evening feeling more alone than ever. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from unknown numbers, some threatening, others filled with cruel mockery. Her social media accounts became battlegrounds, forcing her to shut them down. The local coffee shop where she'd spent countless mornings posted her picture behind the counter, not as a wanted criminal, but with a note saying she was no longer welcome. The barista who had known her order by heart now stared through her as if she were invisible. Even her church, where she'd found solace after her father's death, turned its back. The pastor suggested gently that her presence was causing discomfort in the congregation. Perhaps some time away would be best, he said, his words diplomatic but their meaning clear. The isolation grew suffocating. Former colleagues blocked her number. Friends stopped returning calls. Invitations to social events were rescinded. The community that had once embraced her now treated her like a pariah. One afternoon, while picking up Sarah from school, Rebecca overheard two other mothers talking. "Can you believe she still shows her face here?" one whispered loudly. "I told the principal she shouldn't be allowed on school grounds." Sarah squeezed her mother's hand. "It's okay, Mom," she said, showing strength beyond her years. "We have each other." But even Sarah's support couldn't shield Rebecca from the crushing weight of social exile. She began having panic attacks in public places, her heart racing at the sight of pointing fingers and whispered conversations. The simple act of buying groceries became an exercise in enduring hostile stares and muttered comments. One night, after particularly vicious hate mail arrived at their apartment, Sarah found her mother crying in the dark kitchen. "Maybe Catherine's right," Rebecca sobbed. "Maybe we should just move away, start over somewhere new." "No," Sarah said firmly, wrapping her arms around her mother. "Running away won't fix anything. You taught me that, remember? Before all this happened." The irony of her daughter's words wasn't lost on Rebecca. She had spent 15 years running from her pain, hiding behind her uniform and her standards now. When running seemed like the only option, her 12-year-old was showing her what real courage looked like. While the adult world crumbled around them, Sarah and Emily Johnson's friendship flourished with the pure resilience of childhood. Despite the controversy surrounding their mothers, the girls remained inseparable, their bond growing stronger in defiance of the chaos around them. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Rebecca arrived early to pick up Sarah from the Johnsons' house, where the girls had been studying. Through the living room window, she caught a glimpse of a scene that stopped her in her tracks: Sarah and Emily sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by textbooks, while Camille Johnson sat with them, helping them with their homework. "The answer isn't always what it seems at first glance," Camille was saying, pointing to a math problem. "Sometimes you have to look deeper to understand the real question." Rebecca stood in the rain, watching this simple moment of kindness, feeling the weight of her prejudices even more keenly. Here was Camille Johnson, a woman she had disrespected so thoroughly, nurturing her daughter as if the past had never happened. Sarah's voice drifted through the window. "Mrs. Johnson, why are people still being mean to my mom? She's trying so hard to change." Camille's response was gentle but firm. "Sometimes people hold on to anger because they're afraid of seeing their own faults. Your mom is brave because she's facing hers." Emily chimed in, "Yeah, and my dad says everybody deserves a second chance if they really want to be better. That's why he helped clear your grandpa's name." The conversation shifted as the girls returned to their homework, but its impact lingered. Rebecca waited in her car, tears mixing with the rain on her face, until it was time to pick up Sarah. When she finally approached the door, Camille answered with unexpected warmth. "The girls have been working on their science project," she said, as if this was any normal afternoon. "They're quite brilliant together." Inside, Sarah and Emily were presenting their project idea, a study on how plants respond to different types of music. Their enthusiasm was infectious, their friendship a rebuke to the adult world's complexity. "Mom, can Emily come to our place next time?" Sarah asked. "We need to set up the experiment." Before Rebecca could stammer an answer, Camille stepped in. "I think that's a wonderful idea. Perhaps we could all have dinner afterward." The invitation hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Rebecca met Camille's eyes, seeing not condemnation but an opportunity. "We'd like that," she managed to say. As they drove home, Sarah chatted excitedly about the project, but Rebecca's mind was on Camille's words to the girls. The answer isn't always what it seems at first glance. How true that had proven in her own life. That evening, Emily called to discuss project details with Sarah. Rebecca overheard their conversation, marveling at how easily they moved between scientific discussion and gentle teasing. There was no trace of the prejudice that had poisoned her own worldview. Mrs. Collins, Emily's voice suddenly came through the phone. "Thank you for letting me come over next week. And thank you for making Sarah happy again. She was really sad for a while." Rebecca had to steady herself against the kitchen counter. "Thank you, Emily," she replied, her voice thick with emotion, "for being such a good friend to my daughter." After the call ended, Sarah hugged her mother tightly. "See," she said, "everything's going to be okay. Emily says her dad always says that friendship is stronger than hate." In that moment, Rebecca understood that while she had been drowning in shame and isolation, her daughter had been building bridges. The very family she had wronged was now helping to heal not just her daughter, but her own wounded heart. The morning of the disciplinary hearing arrived with a weight of finality. Rebecca sat in Skylux Airlines corporate headquarters, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, waiting to learn her fate. The room was imposingly formal, a long mahogany table, leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. James and Camille Johnson sat at one end, their presence commanding yet somehow reassuring. The HR director, legal team, and board members filled the remaining seats. Then, unexpectedly, Melissa walked in carrying a thick folder. "Before we begin," Melissa announced, her voice steady but emotional, "there's something everyone needs to understand about why we're here." Rebecca watched, confused, as Melissa began distributing documents to everyone present. 15 years ago, she continued, two men were destroyed by a financial scandal. Thomas Collins and Marcus Thompson are fathers. The room fell silent as Melissa revealed her true identity. "I've spent the last 5 years working alongside Rebecca, watching her pain manifest as prejudice, waiting for the right moment to help her see the truth." She turned to Rebecca, tears in her eyes. "I reported your behavior on Flight 512 not to punish you, but because I couldn't watch you destroy yourself anymore. You needed to face this for both of us, for our father's memory." Rebecca sat stunned as Melissa outlined the years of investigation, showing how James Johnson had worked to uncover the truth about their father's case. She revealed emails, surveillance reports, and court documents that painted a complete picture of the tragedy that had shaped both their lives. "Mr. Johnson," Melissa said, turning to James, "didn't just try to save our fathers. He's been watching over both of us ever since, waiting for the right moment to help heal this wound." James nodded solemnly. "When I bought Skylux," he explained, "I knew Rebecca worked here. I hoped that eventually we could find a way to bring healing to both families. What I didn't expect was for my own family to become the catalyst for that healing." Camille reached for her husband's hand as he continued. "The discrimination on that flight was wrong, Rebecca, but it gave us the opportunity to finally address the root of that pain." Rebecca's world tilted on its axis as the full truth emerged. Every person in her life, Melissa, the Johnsons, even her therapist, had been part of a longer story, one that stretched back to her father's death and forward to this moment of revelation. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why go to all this trouble? Why not just fire me when you had the chance?" "Because," James replied softly, "your father once showed me kindness when I was a young investigator. Before the scandal, before everything went wrong, he believed in me when others didn't. I owed him this chance to save his daughter from the same pain that took him from us." Melissa moved to stand beside Rebecca, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We're not just our father's daughters anymore," she said. "We can be more than their tragedy. We can be their redemption." The room fell silent as the weight of these revelations settled. Rebecca looked around at the faces watching her, not with judgment now, but with understanding. Years of pain, prejudice, and misunderstanding had led to this moment of truth. The disciplinary hearing took an unexpected turn as James Johnson rose from his seat, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate calm. "The purpose of this meeting," he announced, "isn't to end a career. It's to begin a transformation." Rebecca sat perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as James continued. "We've all seen the public calls for termination. Many expect us to make an example of MS Collins, but that would be the easy way out, and easy solutions rarely solve deep problems." He walked around the table, stopping beside Rebecca's chair. "Instead, we're offering you a different path. We want you to help us build something new at Skylux, a comprehensive diversity and inclusion program with you and Melissa leading the charge." Camille joined her husband, her presence adding weight to his words. "Your story, both your father's tragedy and your own journey, has the power to change hearts and minds, but only if you're willing to be completely honest about where you went wrong and how you found your way back." "We're not just offering you a job," Camille continued, her voice gentle but firm. "We're offering you a chance to transform your pain into purpose, to help ensure that bias and prejudice don't destroy other families the way they almost destroyed yours." The board members exchanged glances, clearly surprised by this turn of events. The head of HR cleared her throat. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, while we respect your decision, there are concerns about public reaction." "Let them react," James interrupted. "Real change doesn't come from punishment alone. It comes from understanding, from healing, from turning our worst mistakes into our greatest lessons." Melissa stepped forward, opening her folder again. "We've already drafted an outline for the program. It includes personal narrative workshops, bias recognition training, and most importantly, a support system for employees dealing with trauma and prejudice." Rebecca finally found her voice, though it trembled with emotion. "Why would anyone listen to me after what I did?" "Because you'll tell the truth," Camille answered. "All of it. About your father, about your pain, about how easily hurt can become hate. And then you'll show them there's another way." James handed Rebecca a document, not a termination notice, but a proposal for her new role. "This won't be easy," he warned. "You'll face skepticism, resistance, maybe even hostility. But if you're willing to do the work, we're willing to stand beside you." The room fell silent as Rebecca read through the proposal, her hands shaking slightly. The program would require her to share her story publicly, to face her mistakes head-on, to help others recognize and overcome their own biases. "There's one more thing," Melissa added softly. "We want to establish a scholarship fund in both our fathers' names, to help children affected by financial fraud and systemic injustice." Rebecca looked up, tears streaming down her face. "I don't deserve this chance," she whispered. "Perhaps not," James agreed. "But deserving isn't always the point. Sometimes it's about what we're willing to become. The question is, are you willing?" Rebecca stood slowly, looking around the room at the faces watching her, James and Camille's quiet strength, Melissa's hopeful smile, even the board members' cautious curiosity. In that moment, she felt the weight of her father's memory, of 15 years of misdirected pain, of the choice that lay before her. "Yes," she said finally, her voice growing stronger. "Yes, I'm willing." 5 years after Flight 512, Rebecca Collins stood at a podium in Skylux Airline's main conference center, addressing a room full of new employees. Behind her, a large screen displayed a photograph of two men, Thomas Collins and Marcus Thompson, smiling at a business dinner, taken years before tragedy tore their lives apart. "This story begins with two fathers," Rebecca started, her voice steady and clear. "One white, one black, both destroyed by the same prejudices and deceptions that still plague our society today. But it doesn't end there." The room was silent as Rebecca shared her journey, the years of hidden bias, the fateful flight with the Johnsons, the painful awakening to her own prejudices, and the unexpected path to redemption. In the audience, Melissa sat with tears in her eyes, while James and Camille Johnson watched from the back of the room, their presence a quiet affirmation. The Collins-Thompson initiative, Rebecca continued, gesturing to the program materials before each participant, isn't just about avoiding discrimination. It's about understanding how pain can twist into prejudice and how that prejudice can destroy lives, including our own. The program had become Skylux's flagship training initiative, earning national recognition for its innovative approach to addressing workplace bias. But its real success was measured in the individual stories of transformation, the countless employees who had found the courage to confront their own biases and change. Sarah and Emily, now high school seniors, sat in the front row, their friendship a living testament to the possibility of change. They had become unofficial ambassadors for the program, speaking at schools about breaking cycles of prejudice. Today, Rebecca announced, "I'm proud to share that the Collins-Thompson Scholarship has helped 50 students pursue their dreams of higher education. Children who might have been lost to the same cycle of pain and prejudice that nearly destroyed me." She paused, looking at the photograph of her father. Dad always said that the measure of a person isn't in never falling, but in how they rise after a fall. It took me 15 years and one humbling flight to understand what he meant. As she concluded her presentation, Rebecca invited Melissa to join her on stage. The two women embraced, their father's story having forged an unbreakable bond between them. Their weekly coffee meetings had become a symbol of healing for the entire company. The hardest lesson I learned. Rebecca shared, her voice thick with emotion, is that hate isn't born, it's built brick by brick from unhealed wounds and unexamined beliefs. But so is healing. Every time we choose understanding over judgment, every time we face our own biases honestly, we lay a foundation for change. In the years since that transformative flight, Rebecca had become known not for her mistake, but for her dedication to making it right. The viral video that had once condemned her now appeared in training sessions nationwide, followed by footage of her journey toward reconciliation and growth. The Collins-Thompson initiative had expanded beyond Skylux, reaching other airlines and corporations. But for Rebecca, its greatest success was measured in the small moments in Sarah and Emily's enduring friendship, in the quiet conversations with employees facing their own biases, in the gradual healing of old wounds. Our story isn't finished, Rebecca concluded, looking out at the faces before her. It continues with each of you, with every choice you make, with every prejudice you dare to question. Because in the end, we're all on this flight together. Later that evening, following the presentation, both families gathered in the Johnsons' backyard for their traditional Sunday dinner, a ritual that had begun 3 years ago and had never been broken. The scene was a testament to how far they had come, Rebecca and Camille preparing salad together in the kitchen, James grilling on the patio, while Sarah and Emily sat at the outdoor table planning their upcoming college visits. Stanford's diversity program looks amazing, Emily said, scrolling through her laptop, and they're really interested in our work with the initiative. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. Mom says they've never had co-applicants propose a joint project on social transformation before. From the kitchen window, Rebecca watched the girls, remembering how their friendship had remained steadfast through the darkest days. Camille caught her expression and smiled knowingly. Sometimes our children lead the way, she said softly, passing Rebecca a bowl of tomatoes. They see the world as it should be, not as we've made it. Melissa arrived with her new baby daughter, whom she had named Hope, a choice that moved both Rebecca and James to tears when they learned of it. The infant was immediately surrounded by love, passed from arm to arm as everyone took turns holding her. To think, James mused, cradling Hope while watching the sunset. All of this began with a moment that could have torn us apart. Instead, it brought us together in ways none of us could have imagined. The evening air was filled with laughter and conversation, the aroma of grilled food mixing with the scent of Camille's famous lemon bars. It was hard to believe that 5 years ago, these same people had been on opposite sides of a divide that seemed unbridgeable. As they gathered around the table, Rebecca looked at the faces of her extended family, because that's what they had become. Melissa, her sister in healing, the Johnsons, who had chosen grace over vengeance, the children, who had shown wisdom beyond their years. I've been thinking, James announced during dinner, about expanding the initiative internationally. There's interest from airlines in Europe and Asia. Rebecca smiled, remembering that fateful flight to Paris. From one flight to the whole world, she mused. Dad would have loved that. Both our fathers would have, Melissa added, gently rocking Hope. After dessert, as the stars began to appear, Sarah and Emily presented their proposal for taking the initiative into schools, their enthusiasm infectious as they outlined their vision for peer-led anti-bias programs. See, Camille whispered to Rebecca, they're going to take this further than we ever could. That's how change sustains itself, it grows beyond us. As the evening wound down, Rebecca found herself sitting alone with James on the patio. Thank you, she said simply, for seeing beyond my worst moment to what I could become. James smiled, his eyes reflecting the warmth of the evening. We all have the capacity for both prejudice and grace, he replied. The choice is in which one we nurture. The night ended as it always did, with hugs, laughter, and plans for the next gathering. As Rebecca drove home with Sarah, her daughter suddenly spoke up. Mom, I'm really proud of you. Not just for changing, but for helping others change too. Rebecca reached for her daughter's hand, feeling the full circle of their journey, From that moment of shame on Flight 512 to this place of love and healing, it was more than redemption. It was transformation. The story of Flight 512 would always be part of their lives, but it was no longer a story of prejudice and shame. It had become a testimony to the power of confronting our biases, choosing grace over judgment, and allowing love to bridge the distances between hearts. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of transformation and hope. If this story of redemption, healing, and transformation touched your heart, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you witnessed or experienced similar moments of change in your life? Your story matters to our community. Support our team by subscribing to the channel and clicking the like button. Together, we can spread messages of hope and understanding. Share this video with friends and family who might need to hear that change is possible and that it's never too late for transformation. Join us on this journey of healing and growth.